Hey, welcome to 12-Tone Building Blocks, our monthly series about the fundamentals of music theory. We've been talking about functional harmony, which is the idea that different chords in a key have different functions or jobs to do, and probably the most important job is what's called dominant function, which points you back to the root of the key. It's directional, and it provides the driving force necessary to keep the harmony moving. But why does it only point in one direction? Well, obviously the root is a big deal. It's the anchor that keeps the song grounded, and it's the primary sense of rest within it, so of course we want to point there. But other chords matter too, and sometimes we might want to set one of those up instead. Fortunately, we can do that by exploiting a couple properties of the dominant seventh. For starters, there's only one in each key. If we're playing in A major and you hear an E7 chord, that's the 5 chord and it points you back to the root. If we're playing in D major though, and you hear that same E7 chord, it's suddenly a lot harder to explain. Like, maybe you could look at it as a modified 2 chord, but really it's just not in the scale. So our brain tries to find an explanation, and the easiest one is that it's just borrowed from A major and it's pointing us there. It's almost like modal interchange, where we borrow chords from a neighboring scale, except here we're borrowing from something a little more distant. But dominant function relies on the leading tone, a note a half step below the root of the key, and if we're not actually in that key, then how does it work? How do we know where it's pointing if we don't have a leading tone to guide us? Well, that's why it's important that we're using a dominant 7th chord. Primary dominant function can just use the 5 major triad because the leading tone is strong enough on its own, but for these secondary dominants, we need to add that flat 7th degree. This does a couple things, but first let's review what it does in primary dominant function. If we're in A major, then the 7th degree of the E7 chord is a D. That's the 4th degree of the scale, and it's just a half step above the 3rd. The 3rd degree is really important in defining a scale's overall sound, so much like the leading tone wants to resolve up, the 4th degree wants to resolve down. This gives the chord some additional directionality, making it really clear where it wants to resolve to. But that still doesn't help us explain secondary dominance. After all, in the key of D major, D isn't the 4th degree anymore, so why would it want to resolve any more than our fake leading tone would? Well, it wouldn't. By itself, it's completely stable, but if we're playing a G sharp at the same time, that all changes. Now we've got a tritone, and tritones are the most dissonant interval of all. That, in the end, is what makes secondary dominance work. Neither of the notes on their own really need to resolve, but the tritone does. Playing them both at once makes us anticipate a resolution because even without relying on the functions of certain scale degrees, it's just too unstable not to. From there, we can associate it with other known sounds to figure out where it's pointing, and voila! Secondary dominance. Of course, once we have secondary dominance, the next question is, what about the other functions? Well, when you resolve a secondary dominant, you sort of create a secondary tonic. That is, while the target chord may not feel at rest within the framework of the key, resolving to it still makes it feel, well, resolved, at least momentarily. Theorists call this process tonicization, which in addition to being an important effect, is also pretty fun to say. Secondary subdominant function, though, is a bit more interesting. Subdominant chords serve to set up the dominant ones, which means they come first. When you hear them, they may just sound like normal chords from the key, or they may not make any sense at all. But in both those examples, the chord right before the secondary dominant is probably best viewed not in relation to the key, but to the target chord. That is, if we were in that key, there would be 2 chords which have subdominant functions, so placing them before a secondary dominant creates a classic device called a 2-5, which serves as almost a fundamental unit of jazz harmony. You don't need to set up a secondary dominant with a subdominant chord, just like you don't need them for primary dominants either, but it adds a little extra strength to the resolution and helps wrap everything up nicely. Speaking of which, thanks for watching. Building Blocks was made possible thanks to our patrons on Patreon, so if you want to see more stuff like this, please consider supporting. You can also check out our store, join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.